People are saying I stole from a grieving daughter. They're saying I took advantage of a woman who trusted me, that I stepped into a space that was never meant for me and walked away with everything. And now I'm being asked, no, told, to give it all back. Not because a court ordered it, not because a lawyer found a mistake, but because people think I don't deserve what she left me. They say I manipulated a lonely old woman. They say I replaced her family. They say I crossed a line that someone like me should never cross. And the worst part is, I understand why it looks that way. Because on paper, I'm just a neighbor, a stranger, really, someone who showed up late in her life. And the person demanding answers is her daughter, a daughter who hadn't spoken to her mother in decades, a daughter who didn't come to the funeral, a daughter who never replied when her mother tried to reach out. But still, a daughter. Now she's standing on the other side of this, telling me that what was left behind should be hers, that I had no right to accept it, that keeping it makes me cruel. And I keep asking myself the same question over and over again. Did I do something wrong, or am I being punished for being the one who stayed? Because here's the problem. I don't know if they're wrong. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't expect my life to turn into an argument about money, grief, and loyalty. All I did was show up. I listened. I cared. And somehow that's become something people are suspicious of. I keep replaying every conversation in my head, every moment, every choice, wondering if there was a point where I should have stepped back, where I should have said, this isn't my place. But no one ever says that when someone is alive. They only say it after they're gone, when there's something left behind. And now I'm standing in the middle of something I never meant to be part of, holding on to a decision that wasn't mine to make, but somehow became mine to defend. I don't know what the right thing is anymore. All I know is that a woman I loved trusted me with her final wishes, and her daughter believes that trust should never have existed in the first place.
Legally, it's mine. That's the part everyone keeps reminding me of. The paperwork is clear. The will was signed. The lawyer was thorough. There's no loophole, no dispute, no missing clause waiting to surface. But morally, I'm not sure. Because money doesn't exist in a vacuum, neither does grief. And when those two collide, people stop asking what's fair and start asking what feels right. What feels right to them is simple. A daughter should inherit from her mother. A stranger shouldn't walk away with everything. That's the rule people carry in their heads, even if they've never had to say it out loud before. And I get that. If I strip this down to the bare facts, it sounds awful. A woman dies, her child is still alive, and somehow I'm the one holding the keys, the documents, the accounts, the things she owned. That alone is enough to make people uncomfortable. Then you add the accusations, the messages asking how long I'd been planning this, the implication that I must have known what I was doing, that I saw an opportunity and took it. Some people don't even ask questions anymore. They jump straight to conclusions. They assume there's a villain in every story like this, and that villain is usually the person who doesn't fit neatly into the family tree. And the emotional pressure is constant. Every conversation feels loaded. Every silence feels like judgment. Even when no one says it outright, I can feel the question hanging in the air. Why didn't you give it back? The lawyer was very clear with me. There's no legal obligation, no requirement to share, no claim her daughter can make. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because the woman asking for everything hasn't spoken to her mother in decades. That detail complicates things in a way that makes people uncomfortable too. Some think it changes everything, others think it shouldn't matter at all. A mother is still a mother, a daughter is still a daughter. Time doesn't erase that, at least not in theory. And now I'm caught between two versions of what's right. One version says honoring someone's final wishes matters more than appearances. The other says blood should matter more than circumstance. Every message I receive seems to pull me in one direction or the other. Some are sympathetic, others are blunt, a few are outright hostile. They all carry the same underlying demand: choose a side. What no one seems to understand is that I never wanted to be on either side. I didn't insert myself into this family. I didn't ask to be trusted with something this heavy. I didn't expect grief to turn into a moral test I'd have to pass in front of strangers. And that's why this question won't leave me alone. Because if I'm wrong, I don't want to justify it with legality. And if I'm right, I don't want it to be at someone else's expense. But that's not where this story starts. It starts years earlier, before lawyers, before accusations, before anyone thought there would be anything left to argue over. I'm 32 years old, and in 2018 I moved into that condo for the most ordinary reasons imaginable. I wasn't chasing an upgrade or a fresh start after some dramatic life event. I just needed a place I could afford on my own. Somewhere quiet, somewhere stable. I had been living alone for a while by then, and I liked it that way. I worked a regular job, paid my bills, kept to myself. My life wasn't flashy, and it wasn't falling apart either. It was just normal. The condo was small, but it felt manageable. The kind of place you choose because it makes sense, not because it impresses anyone. The biggest selling point for me was the balcony. It faced the morning sun, and I imagined drinking coffee out there before work, maybe keeping a few plants alive if I tried hard enough. I didn't move in expecting to make friends. I definitely didn't move in expecting to become important to anyone else's life. At that point, I didn't know Valerie existed. She was just the woman in the neighboring unit, someone whose name I wouldn't learn until weeks later. I had no idea she was widowed, no idea she was lonely, no idea she carried decades of regret quietly with her. And I wasn't looking to fill some role for her. I wasn't wealthy, I wasn't especially confident, I wasn't someone who had people lining up to confide in me. I didn't have a plan or an angle or some long-term intention to become part of anyone else's story. I was just a woman living alone, settling into a new place, trying to build a routine that felt peaceful. That's why this whole situation feels so unreal now, because nothing about my life at the time points to manipulation or strategy. There was no moment where I thought, this person could give me something someday. There was no version of me that expected more than polite small talk with a neighbor I might wave to in passing. What mattered to me back then was consistency, quiet, familiarity. And when Valerie slowly became part of that, it wasn't because I sought her out, it was because she showed up in the same place at the same time, week after week, because she remembered my name, because she asked about my job, because she listened when I spoke. That kind of connection doesn't announce itself as important when it's happening, it just feels steady. And that steadiness mattered more than I realized at the time. I met Valerie the way people used to meet before everything was rushed, by accident, without intention. It was early spring, not long after I moved in. I was on my balcony with a cheap watering can and a plant I was already failing to keep alive. I remember feeling slightly ridiculous, standing there in old clothes, trying to look like someone who knew what they were doing. Then I heard a voice from the other side of the railing. She was watering her plants too. Our balconies didn't quite connect, but they were close enough that conversation felt natural. She made a comment about the weather, something light and harmless, and I responded. We talked about plants neither of us was particularly good at keeping alive. It was awkward in the way first conversations usually are, but the next Saturday she was there again, and the Saturday after that. Without ever saying it out loud, we fell into a routine. Saturday mornings became our shared time. Coffee cups appeared, gardening gloves, folding chairs pulled just close enough to the railing that we didn't have to raise our voices. At first, it was all surface level, complaints about the heat, jokes about stubborn plants, comments about birds and neighbors, and nothing important at all. Then, slowly, the conversations deepened. She told me her name was Valerie. She told me she had lived there for years. She laughed easily, but there was something careful in the way she spoke, like someone who had learned not to take up too much space. Over time, she told me she was a widow. Her husband's name was Gary. He had died years before I met her, suddenly, without warning. She didn't speak about him with anger or bitterness. It was more like a quiet acknowledgement, as if that chapter of her life was always present but no longer open. She said she had married young, too young, she joked sometimes. She spent most of her adult life being a wife before she ever learned who she was on her own. When Gary died, she didn't just lose her partner, she lost the structure her life had been built around. Widowhood forced her to start over. She talked about the things she tried afterwards, classes she signed up for and didn't finish, hobbies she picked up and dropped, trips she took alone because she didn't want to stop living just because she was lonely. And she was lonely. Not in a dramatic way, it showed up in smaller moments. The way she lingered in conversation, the way she remembered small details about my life and brought them up weeks later, the way she seemed genuinely relieved when Saturday morning arrived. Those mornings became something I looked forward to more than I expected. Even when the weather wasn't great, even when work was stressful, even when neither of us had anything new to say, it felt comforting, familiar, safe. She started calling her plants her babies and apologizing to them when they didn't thrive. She teased me about my lack of gardening skills. I teased her back about how dramatic she was being over a single wilted leaf. Somewhere along the way, she stopped feeling like a neighbor. She felt like family. And for years, I truly believed she was completely alone. It came up quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it.
We were doing what we always did, sitting on our balconies, coffee cooling in our cups, hands busy with soil and leaves, when Valerie mentioned her daughter for the first time. Just her name. Sam. She said it like it was something she wasn't sure she was allowed to say out loud anymore. I remember responding without thinking, something casual, like, "Oh, I didn't know you had kids." And then everything stopped. Her hands froze mid-motion. She didn't look at me. There was a pause that felt longer than it should have been, long enough that I wondered if I'd crossed some invisible line. Finally, she let out a slow breath and said, "I do," or "I did." That was the moment the story changed. She told me Sam had come out as gay just after graduating high school. Not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. And according to Valerie, Sam hadn't expected it to blow up the way it did. Gary didn't take it well. That's how Valerie put it at first. Simple words doing very little to soften what came next. She said he became someone she barely recognized in that moment. He told Sam she was no longer his daughter, that she was an embarrassment, that she needed to leave and never come back. He meant it. Sam was kicked out that same day. Valerie told me she stood there and watched it happen. She didn't yell, she didn't argue, she didn't follow her daughter out the door. She said she was in shock, that everything moved too fast, that she thought if she stayed quiet, things might calm down later, that Gary would cool off, that there would be time to fix it. There wasn't. Sam never came back. As Valerie spoke, her voice didn't break. She wasn't crying. That almost made it harder to listen to. The way she described it felt practiced, like she'd told herself the story so many times she'd worn down the sharpest edges just to survive it. She said that moment became the dividing line of her life. Everything before it, everything after. She told me it was her biggest regret, not speaking up, not choosing her daughter when it mattered most, not fighting. She said she thought about it constantly, at night, on quiet mornings, during moments that should have felt peaceful. She wondered who Sam became, whether she was safe, whether she was loved, whether she'd forgiven her mother or erased her completely. I didn't know what to say. I was shocked, then I was sad, and then slowly I felt something heavier settle in, an understanding of how deeply that silence had shaped everything that came after. Valerie didn't excuse herself. She didn't justify what happened. She didn't blame Gary alone, even though he was the one who said the words. She blamed herself for staying quiet. She told me she lived with that choice every day. That regret never left her. After she told me all of that, I couldn't stop thinking about Sam. The story stayed with me long after our coffee cups were empty and the plants were watered. It felt unfinished in a way that made my chest tight. Not dramatic, not explosive, just unresolved. The next Saturday and the one after that, I kept wondering whether I should ask the question that had been sitting between us. Eventually, I did. I asked Valerie if she had ever tried to reach out to her daughter. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared out over the railing, her hands resting in her lap, fingers twisted together like she was bracing herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. She said no. She said she didn't know how to begin, that she had waited too long, that any attempt now would only reopen old wounds. She said she didn't know if Sam would want to hear from her, or if she even deserved to be heard. There was fear in her voice, but more than that, there was shame. She told me she was afraid of being ignored, afraid of being rejected, afraid of reaching out would confirm what she already feared, that she had lost her daughter forever, and that the silence was permanent. I didn't push her. I didn't tell her what she should do. I just listened. But later that week, I couldn't let it go. I don't know exactly why I did what I did next. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way Valerie spoke about Sam, like she was still a part of her life, even after all those years. Or maybe it was simply the human instinct to want to fix something that feels broken. With Valerie's permission, I tried to find Sam online. It didn't take long. She was on Facebook, using her real name. Her profile wasn't locked down. There were photos, holidays, friends, a partner. She looked settled, happy even, the kind of happiness that doesn't need to announce itself loudly. When I showed Valerie what I'd found, she cried. Not loud, dramatic crying, just quiet tears sliding down her face as she stared at the screen. She kept saying how grown up Sam looked, how strong, how proud she was of her, even from a distance. That was when she asked for help. She asked if I would help her write a message. We didn't do it right away. She needed time to think, to gather the courage she'd been missing for years. When we finally sat down to draft it, it took hours. She wrote, deleted, rewrote, apologized too much, then worried she wasn't apologizing enough. She didn't want to sound defensive. She didn't want to sound like she was making excuses. She told Sam she was sorry, that she had failed her, that her views had changed over the years, that she regretted staying silent more than anything else in her life. She told her she thought about her every day. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for a chance to talk, to try.
When we finally sent the message, Valerie's hands were shaking. We watched as the little indicator appeared. Seen. She noticed it immediately. She didn't say anything at first, just stared as a screen like it might change if she looked away. Minutes passed, then hours, then days. There was no reply. Valerie tried to tell herself that at least Sam had read it, that at least she knew her mother loved her, that sometimes silence was an answer in itself. But I could tell it hurt. She carried that quiet disappointment with her after that. It showed up in small ways, longer pauses, a distant look when Sam's name came up. Still, she never said she regretted reaching out. She said she was glad she tried. And I truly believed that was the end of it. About a month ago, I came home from work later than usual. It had been an ordinary day, long, but not especially difficult. I remember thinking about dinner, about how quiet the building felt as I unlocked my door. The hallway lights hummed softly. Everything felt normal in the way you don't pay attention to until it isn't. I stepped inside my condo, dropped my bag, and glanced out toward the balcony without really thinking about it. That's when I saw Valerie. She was sitting outside in her usual chair, the one she always used on Saturday mornings. At first, my brain didn't register anything as wrong. She sat out there often, especially when the weather was mild. But something about the way she was sitting didn't make sense. She was too still. Her posture was off, slumped in a way I'd never seen before. Her head was tilted slightly, her arms resting awkwardly at her sides. The balcony door to her place was open, which wasn't unusual, but there was no movement, no sign that she was watering plants or adjusting leaves or doing any of the small things she always did when she was outside. I stood there for a moment, staring. There's a strange delay that happens in moments like that, a refusal almost. Your mind looks for explanations that don't require you to act. Maybe she's resting, maybe she fell asleep, maybe she's just sitting quietly. But the longer I looked, the harder it was to ignore the feeling in my chest. Something was wrong. I called her name. No response. I called again, louder this time, stepping closer to the railing that separated our balconies. Still, nothing. She didn't move. She didn't react. That's when the normal feeling of the day completely disappeared. Everything after that felt distant, like I was moving through it without fully being there. I called for help. I remember voices, instructions, the sound of sirens somewhere below. I remember standing back as people did what they could. She had suffered an embolism. They told me it would have been quick. I nodded when they explained, but I don't remember responding with words. I don't remember crying right away either. I just remember standing there, staring at the space where she had been sitting, trying to reconcile the fact that she wasn't going to speak again. Not to me. Not to anyone. Later that night, after everything had quieted down and the building returned to its usual stillness, I went back out onto my balcony. Her chair was empty. Her plants were still there, untouched. Nothing prepares you for that kind of quiet. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It just settled in, heavy and final, leaving no room for doubt. She was gone.
The days that followed blurred together. I moved through them on autopilot, doing what needed to be done without really processing any of it. I contacted the building manager, I answered questions, I signed things I barely remember reading. At night, the quiet felt heavier than it had ever had before. One of the first things I did once the immediate shock wore off was think about Sam. It felt wrong not to tell her. I found the link to Valerie's obituary and the information for the memorial service and sent it to her. I didn't add anything else. No explanation, no pressure, just the facts. I wanted her to know. I wanted her to have the option to come if she wanted to. She didn't respond. Days passed, then more days. I checked my phone more often than I want to admit, half expecting a message to appear out of nowhere. It never did. The day of the funeral came quietly. It wasn't large. A few neighbors, a couple of people from activities Valerie had tried over the years, some acquaintances who knew her in passing. I stood there listening to stories about her that I hadn't heard before, filling in small gaps of a life I only knew from the later chapters. I looked around the room more than once. Sam wasn't there. No one asked me about her. No one mentioned her. It was like an absence everyone noticed but didn't name. I didn't know how to feel about that. I told myself that grief looks different for everyone, that showing up isn't the only way to mourn. After the funeral, I assumed things would slowly settle. I thought I would grieve, say goodbye in my own way, and eventually get a new neighbor. I thought Valerie's affairs would be handled by professionals, and that whatever came next wouldn't involve me very much.
There was a lawyer managing everything, I knew that much. I assumed he would contact family, sort through documents, close accounts. I didn't expect to be more than a name on a contact list if he needed clarification about something small. I honestly believed that my role in all of this was coming to an end. I thought life would return to something resembling normal. Then the lawyer called. I almost didn't answer the phone. It was an unfamiliar number, and at that point I was exhausted from calls that never seemed to bring good news. But something told me I should pick up, so I did. The lawyer introduced himself and explained that he was handling Valerie's estate. His tone was professional, calm, practiced. He asked if I had a moment to talk. I said yes, even though I sat down immediately, like my body already knew what was coming. He told me Valerie had left a will. That part didn't surprise me. She was organized, careful. It made sense that she would have things in order. Then he told me I was the only person named in it. I remember asking him to repeat himself, not because I hadn't heard him, but because my brain refused to accept it the first time. I waited for him to clarify, to add something I'd missed, a charity, a distant relative, someone else. There was no one else. He said she had left everything to me, her condo, her savings, her personal belongings, everything she owned. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like all the air had been pulled out of the room. I asked him if there had been a mistake. I told him she had a daughter, that maybe something had been overlooked, that maybe the paperwork was outdated or incomplete. He said no. He said Sam was not mentioned anywhere in the will, not as a beneficiary, not as a conditional recipient, not even in passing. Valerie had been very clear. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't excited, I wasn't relieved, I wasn't thinking about money or property or what any of it meant in practical terms. I felt overwhelmed in a way that made my thoughts blurred together. I thanked him because that felt like the appropriate thing to do and ended the call. Then I sat there for a long time without moving. My first emotion wasn't gratitude, it was guilt, a heavy, sinking feeling that settled in my stomach and stayed there. I kept thinking about Sam, about the message she never answered, about the fact that Valerie tried once to reach out and then never again. I wondered if this was what Valerie wanted, or if it was simply what she settled on. I wondered if leaving everything to me was an act of trust or an act of resignation, if it was meant to say something or if it was just the easiest decision for someone who felt abandoned and tired. I replayed our conversations in my head. I searched for clues that I might have missed, a comment, a hint, anything that would make this make sense. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. I didn't feel chosen. I felt responsible, and that feeling didn't go away. A few days after the call with the lawyer, my phone buzzed with a notification I wasn't expecting. It was Sam. Seeing her name on my screen made my heart jump in a way I wasn't prepared for. For a split second, I wondered if she was finally responding to the message her mother had sent months ago, if maybe this was going to be a conversation about grief, or closure, or questions she never got to ask. It wasn't. Her message was long. It wasn't careful, and it wasn't gentle. She was angry. She accused me of taking advantage of her mother, of inserting myself into Valerie's life when she was vulnerable and alone. She said I had no right to what had been left behind, and that I knew it. She told me that whatever paperwork existed didn't matter, because morally, everything belonged to her. She demanded that I give it back. All of it. Her words were sharp and direct. There was no curiosity, no hesitation. She didn't ask how I knew her mother. She didn't ask what our relationship had been like. She told me what she believed had happened and treated it as fact. She said I manipulated an old widow. She said I isolated her. She said I waited until there was no one else left. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. My first reaction was anger, a sudden, hot wave of it that surprised me with its intensity. I wanted to ask her where she had been for all those years. I wanted to remind her that Valerie had tried to reach out, that she had read the message and chosen silence, that she hadn't come to the funeral. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't planned any of this, that I didn't ask for anything, that I didn't even know there was anything to ask for. But as quickly as that anger came, it faded, and in its place was something far worse: doubt. I reread her message more slowly the second time. Then again, I tried to see it from her perspective, and the more I did, the more complicated everything felt. From the outside, I could understand how this looked. A neighbor moves in, becomes close, ends up with everything. I imagined how it must feel to lose a parent without reconciliation, only to find out later that someone else had been trusted with their entire life. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't. I kept thinking about Valerie's regret, about the silence that followed her Sam's coming out, about how much guilt she carried, And now, here was her daughter, convinced that history was repeating itself, that she was being pushed aside again. And that's when I started questioning myself, not just my actions, but my intentions. I went back over every memory, every conversation, looking for signs that I might have crossed a line without realizing it, that I might have stepped into a role that was never meant for me. I didn't know how to answer Sam, and for the first time since Valerie died, I wasn't sure I deserved what she left me. After Sam's message, I went back to the lawyer, not because I thought the legal situation had changed, but because I needed to hear the facts again. I needed something solid to hold on to while everything else felt unsteady. He was clear. The inheritance was mine, completely. Valerie's will had been reviewed, signed, and properly executed. There were no ambiguities. Sam had no legal claim to any part of the estate. He told me that if I chose to give something away, that would be my decision alone, not an obligation, not a correction, a choice. That distinction mattered more than I expected, because legally, this was simple. Emotionally, it was anything but. I kept circling back to the same questions. Did Valerie mean for things to end this way? Did she want me to have everything? Or did she simply want to make sure someone she trusted handled what she left behind? She knew where Sam was. She knew how to reach her. She had seen proof that Sam was alive, stable, building a life. She had time. She could have changed her will at any point. She didn't. That fact feels important, and at the same time, it feels uncomfortable to rely on. Part of me believes that Valerie made a conscious decision, that she wanted her final wishes respected, especially after a lifetime of regretting her silence. That leaving everything to me was her way of choosing someone who showed up, someone who listened, someone who stayed. Another part of me wonders if it was easier for her not to reopen that door again, if leaving Sam out was less about intention and more about exhaustion, if grief and regret made it harder for her to imagine reconciliation than to quietly accept distance. I can argue it both ways. If I keep everything, I'm honoring what's written. I'm respecting Valerie's agency, her right to decide what happens to her life and her belongings. I'm not rewriting her choices after the fact to make other people more comfortable. But if I keep everything, Sam walks away with nothing but questions and resentment, another silence, another door closed without explanation. If I share it, I might ease Sam's pain. I might offer something tangible where there's been so much absence. I might show that her mother didn't forget her completely, even if the will suggests otherwise. But if I share it, am I undoing Valerie's final decision? Am I implying that she was wrong, or that her wishes were incomplete? Am I taking it upon myself to correct something that wasn't mine to correct? I keep coming back to the same two questions, and neither of them has an answer that feels clean. Was this closure or punishment? Am I honoring her or hurting her child? Every time I think I've settled on one side, something pulls me back the other way. The logic doesn't line up neatly with the emotions. The law doesn't soothe the guilt. Compassion doesn't erase the doubt. And the longer I sit with it, the more I realize that no matter what I choose, someone will be hurt. The only thing I don't know yet is whether that someone should be Sam or me. I keep thinking about Sam, about what it must feel like to grow up knowing your own mother didn't defend you when it mattered most, to build a life without her, to learn how to be okay without that relationship, and then to find out years later that she's gone. Gone without a conversation, gone without answers, gone without anything tangible left behind. I can understand why she's angry. I can understand why this feels like another rejection layered on top of an old one. To her, it probably looks like history repeating itself, like once again, someone else was chosen. And I don't want to be that person. At the same time, I can't ignore my own confusion. I never wanted this. I never expected to be part of a family conflict that existed long before I ever showed up. I didn't plan for a relationship that would end with lawyers and accusations and choices that feel too big for me. All I did was care about someone who lived next door. I listened when she spoke, I showed up when no one else did, and I trusted that the decisions she made were hers to make. Some people tell me that sharing the inheritance would be the kind thing to do, that it would show compassion, that it would help heal something that's been broken for a long time. Others tell me that doing so would erase Valerie's final choice, that it suggests her wishes didn't matter, that honoring her means accepting what she decided, even if it makes other people uncomfortable. Both arguments make sense. Both feel heavy. I don't know where responsibility ends and guilt begins. I don't know whether stepping in would bring peace or just create a different kind of pain.
and I don't know how to measure what's fair when grief doesn't follow rules. I'm not trying to punish Sam. I'm not trying to hold on to something out of spite. I just don't know what the right thing is. So tell me, am I wrong for keeping what Valerie chose to leave me? Am I wrong for hesitating to give it away when I was never meant to decide this in the first place? Would I be an a-hole if I don't share the inheritance?